So, Pete,
Yes, Kat.
first podcast. We should probably explain why we're here.
Yes, you probably should, actually.
Chief Transformation Officer at ServiceNow. Clearly, you have a passion for driving change. Why'd you agree to this?
Well, I think you might have told me we had to do this, to be fair. But actually, for me, like I think what's always been missing is this part about actually when we're driving. Tech is interesting, but for me, the impact on people, the impact on the organization, and how we deal with those things is really what's got me excited in the last 20 parts of my career. So yeah, for me, that's why I'm here. I want to see what we can do with it. So excited. But what about you, Kat? Like you, from AI to people transformation, why are we here?
Well, when I embarked in a career in tech, it wasn't because I wanted to play with some cool gadgets, which, by the way, I do enjoy playing with the cool gadgets. I don't have an issue with that. But I still fundamentally believe that technology is here to make the world a better place for people. And I don't think as a tech industry, we always hit the mark. And so I'm just passionate about how can we help people get value out of what they're doing with technology and actually put it to work in a way that makes people's lives better.
Yeah, because we see it every day in our lives at home, and then we're embracing that. But now it's like, how do we bring that to the workplace, and how can we make it simpler and easier for people?
Absolutely. So, a bit of a hot take to start us off. The real blocker to successful transformation is not the technology. It's probably Terry in finance who still wants to print his emails. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, look, I think, look, we probably need to define what transformation is. All right, like when we talk about tech transformation, most people go, "Well, it's cloud, it's moving to some platform." But the reality is that's part of it. As you said, like tech is not generally the problem. It's actually changing how we operate as a result of this technology and how we embrace it. So I think once we understand that, then it gives us a different perspective about how we're going to focus on the change and what's ahead of us.
It kind of feels like, in many ways, transformation has become a bit of a dirty word because people have confused transformation with digitization. Like, let's take a process that's broken and make it digital, still broken, but it, looks cooler, sounds cooler, and maybe it's a little bit more tech savvy than the broken process we had before. Reality is that doesn't really help people make their lives easier at work.
No, effectively what we've done is we've hidden the process behind a pretty interface. We haven't really accelerated our businesses driving change. And that's why, when you look at transformation programs, like only 70% of them are actually successful. And a lot of that comes down to the change piece, because all we've done in ultimately is gone for a one vertical part of the organization, change one set of processes. We've not actually optimized across the enterprise.
I used to call that putting lipstick on a pig. Like, it can be a beautiful shade of lipstick, but it's still a pig.
Mutton dressed up as lamb is the other one we use in Australia.
Well,
maybe cut that out.
No, we're not cutting that out. That's part of the podcast now. I'm going to use that as the catchphrase. There seems to be this myth that, transformation is driven by technology. Buy the product, install the product, and Bob's your uncle. We're off and running. Are we just automating dysfunction?
Well, I think it's a little bit of the old adage with that it's tech searching for a problem rather than actually understanding the problem at the people point of view. So you've got to involve people. Like in the essence, we're going to make their lives better. We actually got to understand where the pain is. All right. We make these assumptions all the time that we actually understand the work that's happening. But how often have we actually sat down, whether it's the old part of walk in their shoes to really understand it, but actually involve them in the process, involve them in the thinking, and involve the detractors in the thinking about what it is, because they're the people you've got to get on board. Because if they become the advocates, then you can make a difference. Without them, you're always going to struggle, in my opinion.
So, Pete, I know you've been spending the last couple of weeks in your household preparing for exams, as have I.
Well, not really.
I feel like I'm becoming an expert in high school psychology. And it's made me realize, we often talk about STEM careers and how arts is a big function of that, because problem solving, you need to have creative skills. I feel like we missed a little bit of a trick in that technology, building knowledge around technology should have also included the psychology of change. And understanding how do you create psychological safety amongst your employees so that change doesn't feel like it's happening to them, but they're part of the solution. They're part of the journey.
Yeah, I think a big part of like, how do you encourage an experimentation? Like you see these tools and we have this sort of part of it is I think at home we sort of embrace the change element. Like we're used to waking up and having Instagram feed us all the things we need to know, or Google Maps telling us where we go and what's the fastest route to get there. But we come to work and we have this expectation it's going to be the same. But that's not real anymore. And I think we have to create the safety around people to experiment. And I think that's a big part of the leadership challenge, which is they need to demonstrate their willingness to evolve. Because if they don't demonstrate, why would the people around them be willing to do that? And I think it's okay. We're all going to get these things wrong some point in time, but it's evolving that. And I think right now, where there's no better time when we think about the AI era we're staring into, we don't really know how it's all going to impact us. But the reality is you've got to start playing with it because you can't stick your head in the sand.
So how do organizations create that open dialogue between like leadership and its people, between technology and the business? How do we create that open dialogue so that people, have the confidence and feel safe to speak up when things aren't working?
It's easy to say, but you've got to start with trust. Like for me, I've always been one of these people which goes, I start with trust. All right. You don't want to see that broken, but ultimately you've got to you've got to make yourself vulnerable. You've got to make yourself open to actually realizing, hey, maybe I don't know all the answers. And I think big part around leadership is this sort of idea of servant leadership. You don't have to leading doesn't mean you stand out the front and make the most noise. It's actually how you empower your people so they feel safe, so they can actually embrace what's happening around them. And I think that's sort of leading from behind. I had a guy I used to work with at Qantas. He used to say this to me all the time, Pete, you don't need to be out the front to drive change. I never really understood that for a number of years, but he was just this superhuman who could empower people and get the best out of them by truly knowing who they were and where the pain was, and just willing to make himself vulnerable at any given point in time. And the amount of things that we did together over a period of time, I learned so much from that individual. So for me, I think it's that part, which is how do you create the space? How do you show to people that you are willing to actually embrace the change ahead of you?
And if people don't feel heard, they're going to find workarounds. And I think there's this perception that workarounds are a form of resistance. Well, it's actually more a sign of resourcefulness. Like if you haven't listened to the people, if you haven't heard what they've said and responded to what they've said, they're going to find the path of least resistance so they can get their job done. And that shouldn't be seen as a negative, but it should actually be seen as a learning opportunity.
Well, I think, like I've said this a number of times, people are a bit like water. They'll find a path. Like water will find a path. All right. So,
and it could do a lot of damage.
Well, and it can do a lot of damage.
If it takes the wrong path.
Correct. And I think that's exactly what happens in change programs is that if you don't make it easy and people don't realize it, but you've got to build in the vehicle to get that feedback. You've got to build in the vehicle for that sort of speed to go, actually, we've heard you and we're going to adapt. Because if people say stuff and you don't respond, then they're going to stop. And I think it's just human nature. Willing to say stuff, I'm willing to put myself out there, but if you don't then take that on and we don't see a reaction to that or a response to that, then people go, well, you're not really listening. So why would I? And then so people stop and then change dies.
So let's follow on that water analogy, because we've all seen what happens when water takes the wrong path and you end up with erosion, and it causes all sorts of problems. Erosion in an organization probably comes in many forms. Yeah. One that jumps to mind for me is shadow IT. Like if people can't get what they need from the technology that you've put in place, they're going to go out and buy an app or sign up to a website. And suddenly you've got this plethora of, technology in your organization that you don't know exists. You're spending a hell of a lot of money on that you probably don't need, lots of duplication across the organization. Like that's a pretty big impact on the bottom line.
Yeah, well, I think this water analogy is taking a whole other turn. But I think when you get into that part, you get a couple of pieces. So one, you get this text sprawl, but you get people talking. And once people are having the conversation and creating negative noise, it's very hard to recover from that component. So I think if you go back to the tech piece I think that's almost a side product later once the transformation's finished and people go, well, I haven't achieved my outcomes. Now I've got to build Band-Aids. Now I need another piece of technology to fit the piece. But you've got to be able to sustain those journey and you've got to build that into the program, I think, early enough. I think on the people side is, again, it comes back to you've got to embrace that feedback. If you see these things happening and people start to derail the conversation, but you need people to become the voice of the change. All right. And I think when all the cases I've been driving change programs, as I got later in my career and realized the benefit of having these people on board is about how do I get them to be the voice and to be them out there talking about what it is. But the only way they're going to do that is you've got to involve them early. They've got to feel like they're engaged in the piece of work.
So we know like change fatigue is real. The pace that technology is innovating, the pace that the world is changing. I think people are just fatigued in general, and the mental load they're carrying, not just in the workplace, but at home, dual income households, people are raising kids while they're, trying to drive careers, and God knows the cost of living is increasing. There's a lot of reasons why people would want to resist change. And I think particularly with what's happening around AI, there is a lot of fear and concern around what that's going to mean for people. How does that have an impact around the success of driving transformation across an organization?
Yeah, this is something I've grappled with for a while. I think like this change fatigue comment, because I think at home, people know almost don't know the benefit, but they're willing to take it on because it's more intrinsically personal to them. And I think what we struggle with at work is we only see the outcome in business terms. We only see the outcome in terms of cost out, bottom revenue up, reducing risk. We forget the human element about how is it going to make their jobs easier. And I think a big part of in change programs, in my part, is we're so focused on telling them what is changing, we actually forget to tell them that part of it's not changing.
And I can't help it. I think I always go back to this, but Simon Sinek's Understanding the Why. Like,
Yeah.
it's just such a brilliant concept. And I think we should apply it in everything that we do,
Correct.
but particularly when it comes to change.
Yeah.
People are far more willing to consider a different way of working if they understand why it's going to add benefit to the organization, why it's going to make life easier for customers, why it's going to make life easier for them at work.
Yeah.
It also means that this whole concept of it doesn't have to be perfect before you roll it out, because if they understand why we're doing it, they're more willing to accept that the first time they use, the new website or the new tool or whatever technology it is, yeah, maybe it's not going to be perfect. Maybe I'll ask a question of my new, virtual agent that doesn't quite answer it. But if they understand why we're doing it, they bought into trying to help it improve and trying to get it right.
I think part of it is to actually help people realize that, this is what we are. This is what AI is showing us more than anything. Like you and I were talking about our kids getting ready for exams. Well, how are we helping them? We're using ChatGPT.
Thank you, ChatGPT,
So,
for
correct.
helping me remember mathematical methods in high school.
Yeah, there's stuff I've forgotten years ago.
Godsend.
Correct. But like, even we're embracing that to go, actually, we need to. And the fact that you and I talk about it with others, then they go, oh, I actually hadn't thought about it. And I think it's those things that help people just reduce that anxiety for people that don't have that naturally built in.
And I think this is part of it. Like a lot of customers or organizations that I talk to, they're still very concerned that, different generations in their employee base may be willing to adopt AI at a different pace. And that's always going to be true. There's a generational difference. There's a cultural background difference. There's probably a gender difference. There's always differences just in people and the way they think. Yeah. However, as you've just said, we're all adopting it as quickly as we can at home because it makes our lives easier.
We can see the benefit to our kids.
Correct.
Right.
So I think people are far more willing to adopt it in the workplace because they see the value that it brings them at home. Yeah. I think where the gap is that many workplaces are being, are slow to adopt or slow to bring those technology innovations to the workplace. And so it creates this level of frustration for employees because they're coming to work and they're not getting the same experiences. It's clunky. And then let's be honest, if you're not loving what you do, it doesn't take much for you to up and go.
Well, I think that's very true. Depend on the generations again. I think like when we look back over technology change, there's always going to be a gender. There's always going to be an age differentiation. Every time, whether it was the internet coming in for e-com, the iPhone boom, now the AI component, like there's always going to be those elements. And we're always going to see this diversity through the workforce. But again, I think people just, we look at this piece of technology and go, how do we embrace it and how do we learn? A lot of the conversation we're having with executives at the moment is around, well, I want you to go really, really fast, but safely. Like they're at two opposite ends. So how do we, and I think organizations are, and rightly concerned, which is they don't want to see their corporate IP leaked out onto the internet. Absolutely makes sense. All right. So how do you put the guardrails? Where can you use the right technology or the right platforms to ensure your people have a safe place to do it? And so that they can be encouraged to actually look at their job and see where the opportunities are to apply this technology, because they're the people that are going to probably tell you. Like sitting up in the executive chairs, we're not going to know. We're actually going to need people to help us look at the day jobs and go, actually, this technology can, wow, how much time did that save me to reduce writing those documents or pulling this research material or pulling material for a podcast together. Those things, it materially makes a difference.
I always use the analogy that it's like for anyone that's raised children, at different ages, you give them a different level of risk and safety, right? You create a safe space for them to try new things and to learn through the art of play, whether it's a sand pit when they're a toddler or whether they're allowed on the full jungle gym, when they're getting a little bit older, because you understand that the way that you learn is to try, to fail, but you want to create a space in which it's age appropriate. I kind of feel like it's the same when it comes to technology. And to your point, we want people to embrace innovation and find better ways of doing things. So create a safe space for them to do it, where you're protecting them from any adverse impact, not just to the organization, but to them personally. But give them the freedom to learn through play, because that's how they build confidence in the technology.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, as kids, no one tells us that's the process we're going through.
Oh, no. No one tells parents either. You just do it intuitively.
Yeah, and I think part of when I became a parent, was to look at it and go, actually, what I worry about with them just changes. At first it's like, are they well and healthy? Then they start school. Do they make friends? Then they go, are they coping with school? And then we all had this big thing called COVID. That was just not
a lot of change management in parenting.
There's a lot of and it is a great place. But I think part of the way we focus on it is certainly look at it and go, well, actually, I need to understand what they're doing. So I spend time with my kids looking at how they use technology. That helps me better understand it, because they're more innately like we're sitting in front of this computer game thing. This is my type of Pac-Man. Like, it's got 3 buttons. If I try
How many TikToks have you made, Pete?
Yeah, 0. Well, actually, that's probably not true. I've got a young son who's very good at making them. But anyway,
there's a few TikTok dances of me out there from lockdown. They will not make it to the internet.
Actually, there might be 1 or 2, but I think I removed myself from most. To be fair, anyone's seen my dancing capabilities? But the new PlayStation, I can't play the games because there's so many buttons on the controller. I'm a simple person when it comes to it. So,
Pete, you're starting to show your age. Maybe we should move on.
It was going to happen at some point.
I love this concept of change theatre versus change leadership. And the way that I define the two, change theatre is when you spend 6 months creating the most perfect launch video for a new employee portal. But you don't actually spend time with the employees to understand how do they want to get help? How do they need to find information? How will they use this in their day job? How to bring them on the journey? And it's all around making it look like we're helping people embrace technology versus change leadership. Whereas I think you have executives that are rolling up their sleeve, they're walking the floors, they're out in the field, and they're not just seeing how people use technology in their day-to-day life, but they're using it themselves. I love that our leadership team, you could ask any of our P5 how they use, one of our ServiceNow apps that all of our employees use on a daily basis. They're all using it to prep themselves before they go into customer meetings. And I just think the more that we can focus on the change leadership side of it versus let's just make it look like we're bringing people on the journey, the better we're all going to be for it.
Look, at the theatre of change has a place as a point in time of celebrating, but it's not going to get you to that point. You need leadership to actually sit down and be with the people and understand and look at, well, has it changed materially what I expected to be able to do? Well, actually, no, it hasn't. And you got to look at, there are different roles and different personas, but you've got to get people involved in that piece and allow them to actually see how it is delivering the outcome and expectation. Because if it's not, we've got a delay. All right. But you can't wait to perfect. All right. But if you're not going to wait for perfect, then I sort of think in change programs where things go wrong is we build out this 1 speed program that's going to take 3 years to get through. And we forget that somewhere along the line, we know it's not perfect and we're going to get feedback. So how do you build in the second part, which is actually going to go faster, smaller, but it's going to take that feedback into the program and actually be able to adjust and make change along the way.
We should never let perfection get in the way of progression.
Correct. Easier said than done, though.
Absolutely.
Because when you look at
put it on a t-shirt or a mug,
but you look at
and hand it out.
Yeah, you look at most organizations. What do they think change management's about? Communication. Like comms is one part of it.
It's an important part, but it's not the whole story.
But it's not the whole thing, and it's not just a marketing story. All right, you've actually got to get involved, and you've actually got to demonstrate the change, because the change is one part technology, but the other part's a big part behavior. And how do you demonstrate? You've got to demonstrate the behavior side.
So how do we do people-first transformation well? What are the key elements of success?
Don't start with the tech.
It's a good start.
It's a good. Well, I think like you got to understand what success is. You've got to have an understanding about what that impact and how you're going to measure it. I think once you get those things right, because the decisions are going to get hard along the way. And so unless you understand that you've got a framework for making those decisions and making those trade-offs and making them transparently and being open about it. Like, I think that's what people forget is they make these decisions, but along the program, they forget to start communicating that that's actually the reason we've adjusted or we've had to pivot or whatever. So then the expectation shifts. So you get this sort of divide of expectation going one way and reality happening the other. And once that gap gets too wide, it becomes almost impossible to recover. So, I think start with the outcome, understand that leadership is not, the theater. It's actually being involved. All right. And find the people. Find the people who are willing to get involved. You're going to have to get people to get on there and be willing to actually talk about it. Allow them to talk about it their way, not with a marketing guff and the other words. Talk about it in real terms of the impact it made to them and the difference it's making to them. So they go, wow. And then you can create more unicorns in your business. We have this sort of fancy term about it, but you want everyone to share.
Change makers, the groundbreakers,
whichever way you want to go.
The rule breakers.
Yeah, correct. So I think the more of those people we get involved and they understand it, and don't cut the cost on change. Change is not just comms, because a lot of big programs end up going, oh, I'll just go and get my, we spend millions of dollars on the tech. We stand up millions of dollars of resources to do it. And then we put this one little line item for change management. And half the time it ends up being contingency.
I think there's also, it sounds like a no-brainer, but co-designing with the users. And I want to just put a massive, exclamation mark on the fact that not all users are the same. And I think organizations often forget there is a huge cultural difference, not just in the way people use technology, but in the way people work and the way that people adopt change. I see far too many projects where, organizations are like, oh yeah, we co-designed with the users. We got our teams together in the US. It was 4 a.m. for people on the other side of the world, but that's okay because we got a big group together. And it's like, yeah, but the way that people work in the US versus China versus Japan versus Singapore versus India versus Australia and New Zealand, like we work differently. We resonate with storytelling and communication in a different way. The way that leadership comes to the table and convinces people to get on the journey with us is very different. And I think until organizations really pay attention to that cultural difference, you're almost setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah, look, I think, it's not so much about convincing, but it's about how do you ensure we're inspiring them to understand what that impact is going to be. And I think you've got to find the moments, we call it moments that matter, but you've got to find the moments where you can celebrate.
So closing thoughts, Pete, how do we wrap it up?
Well, that's a big question to finish the podcast, isn't it? Look, I think, so we go back and like we started this was like, why did we want to do this podcast? Like, I think we understand, like we both work in technology. We both have technology backgrounds, but we realize that the big part of this is embracing people into it and helping them realize the benefit of what that is. Not just the benefit of the organization, but the benefit in the way they work. And I think the more we can get that out there as a message, then I think, and help people understand that leadership is not something you say, it's something you do. And that leading from behind and empowering your people. How about you, Kat? Like, this was sort of your brainchild, these podcasts. So, how are we going to close out?
I would just be happy for people to walk away and remember that successful transformation is innately personal, enabled by platform. As an industry and across every organization, we need to bring people back into the story, particularly as we look at AI-driven transformation.
Let's put humans in the loop.
Yeah, legacy systems are hard to deal with, but I think legacy mindsets are harder. Thanks, Pete.
Thanks, Kat. This was good.
It was fun. Let's do it again.
That's right. Next time, over a glass of wine.